You are listening to Danièle's podcast. On Danièle's podcast, we dive into everything that drives the DIY scene, past and present. The music, the movement, the mindset. This interview series with Michael Murphy is inspired by his latest book, Pop Music Management: Lessons from the Managers of No1 Albums, published by Routledge. True to the DIY punk spirit, Michael shows aspiring managers that achieving a #1 album isn't just a dream, it's a deliberate journey with many different paths. We'll explore the role of music managers, what makes management good or bad, and more. The world might have been more culturally connected than we often think, so maybe it's no surprise that Epstein's management style sent ripples far and wide. As unexpected as it may seem, even across the pond, Linda Ronstadt found herself benefiting from the Beatles network.
Yeah, that's another extraordinary link that you wouldn't expect. You think the Beatles, Linda Ronstadt? What's that? Where's the link? Her manager was part of the Beatles social network. He was a young guy, well-educated young guy called Peter Asher, and his sister was asked to review an early Beatles concert. And she was an actress, Jane Asher, and she went and she thought, hey, it's great. And she gave it a good review. And Paul McCartney thought, hey, that's Jane Asher, the actress. And they started going out with each other. And he lived in Liverpool. She lived in London with her family. So they were obviously quite liberal, the family, and they gave Paul McCartney a room in their house. And the room meant that this young guy, Peter Asher, had a Beatle in his attic and had access to him. And, you know, it wasn't just, oh, I'm going out with your sister. How's it going, Sonny? Like, he wrote songs, and not all the songs went to the Beatles. And he wrote a song for this young guy, you know, the younger brother of his girlfriend. That's incredible. And they get a record deal. He was in a band called Peter and Gordon, a duo of two guys. They got a record deal. They did a bit of business. They had a bit of a hit, both sides of the Atlantic. And Peter Asher decided America is really exciting and dynamic, and that's the place for me. And he's a producer. He's from the accounts of the people who are managed by him, he's an incredibly good guy. And you mentioned that, you know, the managers that you want to read about are the managers who said, my artist comes first. And that includes even over me, over my interest, like the artist should come first. You know, that's my job. My job is to protect the artist. And, you know, from Linda Ronstadt's autobiography, like there's bits of it, Danièle, that are like a love poem. And you think, you know, were these people in love? But it's just, she loved the experience of being managed by this man. And she felt he was ethical, that he gave her freedom to create, that he wasn't sexist. You can imagine the Los Angeles, the Californian music scene, and in that era, what it must have been like for a young woman. And he protected her. He made it very, very safe for her to create in a totally uncompromised fashion. And he came from the Beatles network, and he was offered a job actually by the Beatles when they set up Apple Records. They said, do you want to come and be our A&R guy? And he said, yeah. What a great job, you know, finding bands for the Beatles. And he found an American guy called James Taylor. He recommended him to the Beatles. But then the label didn't quite suit him, and it didn't work out long term. But he absolutely is, from the accounts of his artist, the paradigm, role model, gold standard, you mentioned that term, of what feels good from a manager, from a client's perspective.
It was time to shift our focus across the pond and dive into some key moments that shaped the history of US pop management. One of the most fascinating stories is that of Sid Bernstein, a visionary driven by his roots as an immigrant's son. He had a gift for creating an audience for events that even then had only existed in his imagination. And when it came to selling a band, he knew the secret. Think like the audience.
When you study the history of management, one moment that's really interesting is that something called the marketing mindset emerged. In the old days, it was how cheaply can I produce the product? And the cheaper the product, the bigger the profit. And then with the marketing mindset, it was no, it's not about how cheaply, it's how can we address a need? How can we look at what customers want to buy and maybe even manufacture a need? And Sid Bernstein is a brilliant example of that. So he serves in the war. He famously, and again, you know, what you're saying about the continent, how the links were more vibrant in the 50s and 60s than they were later. He served in France during the war. And one of his jobs was putting on gigs in the village where he was stationed. And, you know, that was really, really good. It did, you know, it allowed the GIs to socialize rather than just being a kind of a presence that didn't mix with the locals. It allowed the locals to make some money from the service people stationed abroad. But he comes back, and there was a GI bill where a lot of the soldiers could go and get a third level education, which is really important in you know, how do you deal with people who don't have work? And you know, you mentioned his viral campaign. And he was this social agitator. He didn't like the way the world was. And I remember that Niall McGurk from the Hope Collective, he had a quote now. It went something like this, that if you've got something to complain about, you've got something to change. And Sid Bernstein was very, very much of that mindset. And he noticed that there was a wave of fascism that was kind of getting bigger and bigger in the States, in New York, in cities, and it was very anti-Jewish. And he thought, like, I fought for America. Like, no, how can people say that I've no part of America's present and its future? So he would challenge these people who were on the street saying that Jews have no place in America. And he brilliantly start organizing, you know, they'd find out where one of these people was going to give their speech, and a number of people would go to those talks, and they just burst into song, singing the American national anthem, which is one of the most subversive things you can do. It's the national anthem, and these people are saying, we hate Jews and they shouldn't be American, and they're not part of our culture. And then suddenly there's people there who fought in the war, many of them, and who were singing the national anthem. Like it was really, really, it was an amazingly creative response. He also did stickers that he put around stickers on buildings, on the subway, a viral sticker campaign, you know, because he felt that there was too much hate in America. So that's his background. I was fascinated when I read his autobiography. He detailed that history, but it does give context for what he did. And he heard the Beatles because when he went back to college, one of his courses, it said, read a newspaper that's not American every week. And he read about the Beatles. And he thought, they sound great. But he couldn't hear them because no one was playing them in America. No one was releasing the records. Don't forget at the start, no one would release the Beatles records. And, you know, Epstein had got the black record label saying, like, will you put this out? And Bernstein got in touch with Brian Epstein and said, look, I think your band are great. When he eventually did hear them, and I'd like to book them in America. And Brian Epstein was thinking, that's really, really great, but I don't think anyone would go and see them. Which was, you know, he could have taken the guy's money and said, yeah, I'll take your money and put them on the gig, but it would have damaged their reputation. But he saw the opportunity and he advertised the Beatles gigs. He created a demand for them. You know, the Beatles are coming. He transformed the live music industry because no pop band had played to the types of numbers of people. He also brilliantly, when the Beatles were playing in New York, in Flushing Meadows, there was, and it might have been one of the first screens that you could see at an event, because it was used to it. It was a baseball stadium. And the guy running it was so happy that it was packed full of young people, because it was, great payday. You can imagine the number of hot dogs and sodas that they sold. I said, like, if you want to put something up on that screen, a message, feel free. And he had started working with a young American band called the Rascals, sometimes the Young Rascals. And so he thought, what will I put up on the screen? And brilliantly, he thought, this is packed full of young people who are Beatles fans. He just put up, the Rascals are coming. Like, it's the most brilliant viral marketing campaign. Because you've got the Beatles fans who clearly love pop music, and now they're thinking, who are the Rascals? What are the Rascals? And it went into the subconscious of those fans. Radio station people who would have been there thought, hey, the Beatles are huge, but hey, it sounds like we've got a happening pop group. And they go number one. So they're one of the first pop number ones. And it's through that, that marketing mindset, that creating a demand rather than waiting for people to discover your product.
And of course, Beatlemania sparked a response in the US. Cue the Monkees. But were they the ultimate manufactured boy band?
In this case, the genius of the Beatles was film and television. Like, if any time they went on TV, they were fabulous. They were funny. They were really, really quick-witted. They were incredibly gifted entertainers, not just when they sang. And people in television in America thought, here's the way to form a band and to make a band and to popularize a band would be to do TV series. And this is where the Monkees came in. Were they the first boy band? They could have been, except I would say that going back to the church and management, I would say that the castrati choirs were earlier boy bands, and they were permanent boy bands in a sense. I would say that some of the great choirs that still exist, that there are still boys' choirs that exist. So I'd say they were boy bands. But in terms of a manufactured pop band that goes to number one, absolutely, it's the Monkees. The strange thing about the Monkees is that they're a manufactured boy band, and they're also fantastic. Like, they're really, really great. And it's because they're not done through the arrogance of a boy band manager. They're done by someone who thinks youth culture is kind of interesting. So wouldn't it be cool if we got the best producers, the best songwriters, the best everything? So everything about the Monkees is gold standard. So it wasn't just, let's throw a few lads together. The auditions were very, very intense, and they were incredibly successful. And because so many things go back to the Beatles, a lot of people might have felt really, really offended. Brian Epstein, a different personality type, would have been offended by, hey, the Americans have just invented Beatles, Monkees, pop band just like us, who do the things that even use the same film editing gimmicks that the Beatles used in their films. And he could have felt very offended, but instead he thought, hey, I'll get in touch with them and I'll see if they want me to organize their gigs in England. So he made money from the Monkees, and they became friends with the Beatles. There was a lovely, positive crossover between them. So it was this extraordinary moment where the Beatles were so open, so generous, so helpful to so many people, even though they were the biggest pop band, arguably, that ever lived. They were very, very down to earth, and they were very helpful to a lot of other people.
Now get ready for part 4 of our interview with Michael Murphy, when we dive into the untold, jaw-dropping story of the powerhouse women behind the Gordy family and how they helped shape Motown's music empire.